Hi there, this is Llarold, and this is my in-depth Protection Paladin guide for Season 4 of Shadowlands. I'm going to cover all the usual stuff I do in a class guide, talk about Covenants, Legendaries, and everything you need to know to succeed while playing a Protection Paladin. As normal, I've put in chapters so you can skip around as needed to rewatch segments and so on. Okay, I'm just going to move through this intro real quickly, but before I finish, like and subscribe. That's it. I wrote this guide up back before Season 4 started, and I had planned to do a little joke section here at the start, making fun of how Blizzard didn't make any changes to the class, but then, right before the season went live, they buffed Prot Pallies. Pallies received an increase of 5% armor, that's just on all the time, and a 5% buff to the block chance added by Holy Shield, so it now grants 20% extra block chance instead of only 15%. You take that talent 100% of the time already, so basically just 5% more block, 5% more armor. Those are both great buffs, and Pally does feel, I guess, about 5% tankier now than it did in Season 3. No real surprise there, but it's pretty nice. I think it's also important to reflect on how Protection Paladin played in Season 3 of Mythic Plus and Sepulchre of the first ones as a raid. The defensive requirements in Sepulchre were much higher than they had been in Sanctum, and as a result, Paladin took a serious hit in terms of their viability as a high-end raiding option. The class still deals tremendous amounts of damage, and it's a really fun tank to play in slightly less serious content, but for like world first race level play, it was a real liability in the last tier. It just wasn't capable of surviving big spikes of damage that Monk and Blood DK were able to shrug off without any real issues. That being said, I found it to be much stronger for pugging Mythic Plus dungeons than Brewmaster Monk, even though I liked Brewmaster Monk in Season 3, and really about on par with Blood DK in the low 20 plus key range. I realize that doesn't really hold up once you get way up into the upper 20s and the 30 plus range, but for people who are mortals like myself, doing keys that aren't at the absolute top pinnacle end of Mythic Plus gameplay, I actually think Paladin might be the very best tank you can play, especially when you're pugging and playing with uncoordinated groups where you just don't know if you can get other people in a group to reliably CC and interrupt mobs. I would put it right along with Vengeance Demon Hunter because it is, or both of them are, great AoE DPS options that aren't that difficult to play, and they both have incredible interrupt utility. I mean, Prot Pallies is by far the best interrupting spec in the entire game, and you can completely carry an uncoordinated group's interrupts by yourself in a lot of dungeons on a Paladin. During the first week of Season 4, doing some of the upper Karazhan runs on other tanks, in pugs and in guild groups, killing Medivh was a bit of a struggle. You know, even some of the guild groups where we were trying to be coordinated, but like we had 3 casters or something, which is not good interrupt comps, that was pretty tough. Then I did an upper Karazhan on the Paladin, and I think I had 28 interrupts on the boss. He barely got any casts off, and it was hilariously easy, even on Tyrannical. Protection Paladin still has some survivability concerns compared to some of the other tanks in Mythic Plus, and that is the liability I would say that it carries to accommodate for all of its great strengths. The buff to Paladin's armor and block chance has helped, but Pally is definitely not as tanky as like Blood DK, for example. Still, Paladin brings incredible damage, incredible group utility, and it's a really good tank, particularly in Mythic Plus. There's just no other tank that can come close to a Prot Pallies in terms of covering up mistakes when playing with uncoordinated groups. I've already talked about Avenger Shield a bunch, but you have several other pieces of really strong defensive utility as well. You can heal with Word of Glory, or use Lay on Hands to keep party members alive. You can use Blessing of Sacrifice or Blessing of Protection to protect party members who get fixated by enemies or targeted by boss mechanics. And all of that is unique to Prot Pallies. No other tanks can do 30 interrupts on Medivh. No other tanks can off-heal and out-heal the healer while still tanking and doing tons of damage. And no other tanks have as much single target burst damage as a Paladin. So yeah, maybe you have to give up some sort of defensive consistency to get all of that, but I think that's okay. Now let's move on to Protection Paladin's tier set bonuses. The 2-piece bonus gives you a free 12% block chance just for playing your rotation. It's really good and it adds a ton of value for the 4-piece. The 4-piece is a lot more interesting. It gives you a chance equal to your block chance to cast Judgment at your enemy whenever you take damage. A decently geared Paladin, gearing for Mastery and using Holy Shield, which was just buffed, is going to have considerably over 60% block chance, pretty easily. 60% block chance was very easy to achieve with relatively high-end gear in Season 3, so upwards of 65 should be pretty doable now. If you're in Mythic Plus and taking the Mastery buff, which to be fair, you probably won't want to do that. You probably want to take the Haste buff most of the time in Mythic Plus, but let's just say that you took Mastery because you were trying to prove a point in a video guide. You could very realistically get over 80% block chance, which is pretty insane. Basically, this means that, say, 65 to 80% of the time, when you take damage, you cast Judgment. This works for all types of damage, including damage over time effects. The Judgment generates holy power and triggers other standard Judgment effects like talent interactions such as Judgment of Light or Conduit interactions. It's basically just a regular Judgment. This effect has a 3-second internal cooldown, so the difference between being at like 60% block chance and 100% block chance isn't that huge. It tends to proc about on cooldown regardless of what your end block chance actually is. Early on in Season 3, this bonus was worth like 3,500 DPS in single target. Now that we have a ton more gear, it's quite a lot higher. It's still a little difficult to know exactly because it's going to depend on your gear, but basically over 4,000 DPS, probably over 5,000 DPS once you have pretty good gear. That's an insane 4-piece bonus. Most DPS classes aren't even getting that. Prot Pallies is still in a really good spot. You easily have enough holy power to maintain 100% uptime on Shield of the Righteous, so most of the new holy power that you gain out of the 4-piece can be spent on Word of Glory casts to sustain your health pool or to heal your party members, or you can just do what I do most of the time and keep on casting Shield of the Righteous for even more damage. It's great. Now let's go over Covenants. You basically have two options on a Prot Pally. Kyrian is the best Covenant for Prot Pally in Mythic Plus. Legitimately, like over 99% of Prot Pallies in Mythic Plus over the level of 20 even are playing Kyrian. If you're just doing weekly keys, or even if you're trying to play push 20s, you could get away with playing some sort of non-meta Covenant, but Kyrian is the right choice, and it's easier to play than the alternatives, so I think that doing something different is, you're just kind of handicapping yourself for no reason. It adds the most offensive and defensive value in Mythic Plus. It's simple, it's powerful, it's just the best. The Kyrian ability is Divine Toll. It shoots out up to 5 Avenger shields at nearby enemies. Much like the 4-piece bonus, proccing just regular judgments, each of these is just a regular Avenger shield. So they generate holy power, they interact with talents, they silence, they interrupt, they do all the stuff a regular Avenger shield would do because that's what they are. Divine Resonance, the Kyrian legendary power, causes you to shoot out 3 extra Avenger shields over the next 15 seconds after you cast Divine Toll. Again, these are just regular Avenger shields, so they have all the normal interactions that a regular Avenger shield has, talents, conduits, etc. They generate holy power. This is a really good power in Mythic Plus. It helps just cement how powerful Paladin is as a Mythic Plus tank, especially at covering up interrupts in, uncoordinated bug groups. Now let's cover Venthyr, which is the more popular option in raids than Kyrian, and I do think it's worth running basically 100% of the time in raids. Venthyr does insane DPS in raids when you're able to overlap Ashen Hollow with other cooldowns like Wings, Seraphim, Strength Potion, on-use stat trinkets. When you layer all those effects together, you can deal absolutely insane amounts of burst damage. That being said, the defensive value that Venthyr provides is very minimal outside of big Ashen Hollow windows, which is more of a raid healing cooldown. So for more consistently dangerous fights like Ragallon or the Jailer, it isn't the best defensive option. Technically speaking, Necrolord is the best defensive option for single target, but I don't think that's really worth going over. There's basically no reason to ever run that anymore. It got used during like Mythic Ragallon and Jailer progression, and that's it, and that's in the past. I think ultimately if you really needed the defensive stability that you would get out of playing something other than Venthyr and raids, you probably just wouldn't play Paladin at all. Radiant Embers is the Venthyr legendary power. It's pretty simple. It just adds 15 extra seconds of uptime onto Ashen Hallow. If you cancel Ashen Hallow early, it grants some cooldown reduction, but that usually isn't worth doing. Now let's jump into Soulbinds real quickly. For Kyrian, it's Mechanicos. This is the standard setup for Mechanicos and Mythic Plus. He is by far the best Soulbind, and it's not even close. For Venthyr, Theotar is the man. General Draven is okay. I think, if you were gonna do Mythic Plus as Venthyr, I think I would probably run General Draven, but you're just so much better off playing Kyrian there that basically you just want to run Theotar and do everything you can to maximize your DPS and raids during those burst windows, and then, just play for survival if you need to outside of those periods. Ultimately, run Theotar, stand in his umbrellas when they proc, do like 30,000 damage or more with every one of your Hammers of Wrath. It's pretty sick. Now that we've talked about Soulbinds, let's go over Conduits. Protection Paladin Potency Conduits are insanely good. No matter which Covenant you're playing, the Covenant Conduit is going to be worth running in every tree. That's true even if you play Necrolord or Night Fae for whatever reason, those are still very good conduits. Vengeful Shock and Punish the Guilty are the two other options available beyond your Covenant conduit, and they've both been pretty competitive with each other thus far in Shadowlands. Basically, Vengeful Shock is more useful in Mythic Plus, and Punish the Guilty is more popular in raids. I had thought going into Season 3 that the tier set might make Punish the Guilty more popular in Mythic Plus as well, but that never wound up being the case. Vengeful Shock is definitely the go-to in Mythic Plus, Punish the Guilty in raids, that's it. Paladin's Endurance Conduit options are also pretty strong. Resolute Defender is excellent. It significantly increases the uptime of Ardent Defender, both by extending its duration and reducing its cooldown. This is just one of the best bonuses around. It's really insane how good this bonus is, and when you compare it to basically every other tank class, it's really impressive that they managed to pack this much defensive power into a single conduit. A system that you look at Blood DKs for the first half of the expansion, they basically got nothing out of conduits, and then there's this one that's doing more than most other whole conduit setups for tanks. Very impressive. Shielding Words is also pretty good. It grants you a shield worth a decent portion of the healing that your Word of Glory deals. Now, if you're healing other people with Word of Glory, my initial conception when I read this over a year ago is that it would be shielding them, and that seemed pretty cool. It still shields you even if you're healing other people. It's fine, it's a good defensive bonus while you're tanking, and it rewards you for off-healing other people, but ultimately, it's always shields on you. Now, for when you're trying to live through big bursts of damage, that's great. It gives you even more bursty healing, whatever, survival components in your self-healing, which is good. But, ultimately, I guess it's not quite as good for off-healing as it might have looked at the initial glance. Still very good, still worth using, basically all the time. Golden Path is a very steady, stable trickle of healing anytime you're standing in Consecration, which you should be doing as much as you possibly can. Lastly, Royal Decree is another decent option. It reduces Guardian of Ancient Kings cooldown slightly, which is fine, usually not as good as Golden Path. And it also gives you a free Word of Glory, which is good. I generally prefer Golden Path over Royal Decree, but it can be a useful bonus since it provides a free heal when you are popping defensive cooldowns and you would presumably need a free heal the most. The other conduits are all pretty forgettable. And finally, Finesse Conduit, since you are going to have to take one in each tree. Lights Barding adds a ton of extra duration onto Divine Steed, which is your only mobility skill, and that really helps Paladin out a lot. I wouldn't really even consider using any of the other options. Now let's move on to Legendaries. First off, you're going to want to use Mastery and Haste missives for any Legendaries that you craft. Bulwark of Righteous Fury is the go-to legendary for Mythic Plus. It adds an enormous amount of AoE DPS. You might think, hey, this doesn't provide any kind of defensive value. Should I run something else? No. The amount of damage that this provides is insane. It is worth running even at the absolute highest, most deadly levels of the game. This is a gargantuan DPS increase in Mythic Plus and a 100% must-have. You can wear it as a ring or a shoulder. I would personally wear this as a ring. Next up is Mad Paragon. This is usually the best raid legendary, and once again, it adds an enormous amount of damage. It synergizes really nicely with Ashen Hallow. It's awesome, and I would use this 99% of the time in raids. You can craft this in the belt or boot slot, and I would go with belts. Now as for where to craft your unity, that's kind of up to you, at least somewhat. Prior to Season 4, I would say that you should use Unity to fill in a gear slot where your item level is lower, and I guess that's technically still true, but since 291 is now the maximum item level for Legendaries, but non-Legendaries are scaling up into the 300 plus item level, you actually want to put Legendaries on low budget slots like bracers and belts, and that's where I would prefer to craft Unity. The ideal, best in slot place to wear Unity on a Protection Paladin is probably belt, but since you might be overlapping that with Mad Paragon, bracers is probably another safe spot. I personally have multiple Unities crafted on my Paladin, a Unity belt that I wear when I'm doing Mythic Plus with Bulwark of Righteous Fury, and Unity bracers that I wear when I'm doing raids with Mad Paragon on a belt. So just to recap at the end here, Haste Mastery are your stats. You run Bulwark of Righteous Fury on a ring as Kyrian for Mythic Plus, you run Mad Paragon on a belt as Vintir for raids, and finally, craft Unity wherever it fixes up your worst piece with the long-term goal of Unity on bracers or belt. Alright, now let's move on to talents. Paladins have a main raid setup and a main Mythic Plus setup, but they also have a lot of swappable options across some of the tiers. In the first tier, Holy Shield is basically locked in all situations because of the tier set bonuses. It's the tankiest option, and because of the tier set bonuses, also the best option for DPS. And it got buffed. That's terrific. It also makes Mastery a very, very good stat, which is nice. First Avenger in the second tier is very good in AoE and Mythic Plus, but not at all good in single target. Crusader's Judgment is very good in single target for maximizing your DPS and helping with your holy power generation. So that's a pure raid talent. In the level 30 tier, you can run whichever option you prefer. I like Blinding Light because it provides an AoE CC, and you can sort of use that like an interrupt, although it will break instantly on non-holy damage. So, basically always instantly in Mythic Plus. That's fine. Still useful for disrupting enemies. You could take Fist of Justice if you want a more reliable single target stun on a pretty short cooldown. That's an okay option as well. In the next tier, I use Cavalier if I'm doing like Torghast or world content or leveling, but otherwise I default to Unbreakable Spirit. I would probably use Unbreakable Spirit if I was leveling through dungeons as well. Blessing of Spell Warding can be extremely powerful in raids where there are boss spell damage mechanics that you're able to immune, but that's sort of a case-by-case basis. Just to give a couple of examples, you can use it to immune the spell damage Skolex Breaths without losing threat, because it, unlike Blessing of Protection, it doesn't cause you to lose threat if you have Blessing of Spell Warding on you. You can also use it to immune the damage from Denathrius's Frontal Cones, or the damage and the stacking dot effect from Sylvanas' Phase 3 combos. The Banshee's Bane won't be applied. It's very nice. You can use it on other raid members when Kel'Thuzad casts his Frost Blasts on them. They just simply won't take damage. They step out, and it's as if they're ice blocking or turtling it or whatever, but they don't have to use a cooldown. So it's a really good spell, but it is very much situational and totally driven by the encounter specifics. The choice between Divine Purpose and Seraphim in the next tier is pretty simple. You take Seraphim to maximize your raid DPS, you take Divine Purpose to safely fuel your Shield of the Righteous and Word of Glory casts in Mythic Plus. Now you can maintain 100% uptime on Shield of the Righteous, especially in raids, without taking Divine Purpose. I mean, technically speaking, using Seraphim lowers your Shield of the Righteous uptime because it also costs Holy Power. That's okay, you have so much excess Holy Power, even without running Divine Purpose, that maintaining Shield of the Righteous uptime at 100% is very doable. The difference is that in Mythic Plus, you are able to get a lot more AoE damage consistently out of those Divine Purpose procs if you're just throwing them into overcapped Shield of the Righteouses, Or if you are playing for group utility, or even just your own personal healing utility, you get a ton of free Word of Glory casts that you can use to prop up your health pool and the health pools of the people in your party. Because of that, I think it is a mistake to not run Seraphim while in raids because it adds so much damage potential, but I think that Divine Purpose is always worth running in Mythic Plus because it adds so much healing potential that is more useful there. If you're not trying to do what you can to boost your damage on Paladin, I feel like you're losing out on one of the main strengths of the class. Running Seraphim in Mythic Plus just doesn't really do enough. There isn't enough opportunity to line that Seraphim up with big burst damage opportunities like there is in raids. Judgment of Light interacting with the 4-piece is really strong. It adds a lot of passive group healing, and it's absolutely worth considering if you're just wanting an easy option. I initially hated Hand of the Protector as a Mythic Plus talent. I realized that it was very popular and strong, I just didn't like the playstyle of trying to keep the party alive with Word of Glory casts. Then I started using it while pugging my way up to 3k early on in Season 3, and I have to say it's amazingly good. I really like the ability to see a dangerous trash mob or a boss start to wind up a big channeled skill on a group member, and instead of them just dying, I can slam a Word of Glory into them for like 60 or 80,000 healing, and they're totally fine. They're back at full. I found myself doing tons of spot healing as I got more comfortable on Paladin, and that allowed my group's healers to do a lot more DPS too, and that was part of the calculus of whether you should run Divine Purpose or Seraphim as well. This talent tier comes into play with that a little bit. Ultimately, it's just a great talent. The slow from Consecrated Ground can be nice in Mythic Plus too. I have to say I've stopped using it entirely because I just prefer the playstyle of Hand of the Protector. Consecrated Ground is a good lazy choice in Mythic Plus, especially if you're still getting, the hang of the way the class plays and you don't feel comfortable using Hand of the Protector. I think that's fine. But once you do have a comfort level where, you feel pretty good about staying alive and managing the groups, interrupts, and root, and so on, running Hand of the Protector is a better choice. It's much stronger if you're trying to be a little more serious with your Mythic Plus. And, you basically can do everything in the group. You can probably lead damage on a lot of pulls. You can certainly lead interrupts. You're obviously going to be tanking. And you're probably going to be out healing the healer on the whole in runs where you run Hand of the Protector and are really maximizing its value. For raids, I basically always run Judgment of Light. It's just a lot of free raid healing. It just adds up to be a ton over the course of a fight, and it's just totally passive and free. I wouldn't be trying to throw out a bunch of free or not free heals in raid. I think that's a bit more complicated, and I think healers would be mad. And finally, in the last tier, Righteous Protector has been the most popular talent in both Raid and Mythic Plus all expansion long, and thanks to the tier set providing even more holy power to throw at it, it's still the strongest option by a million miles. Final Stand can be okay if you're undergeared and struggling to stay alive, and that applies both in Mythic Plus and in Raids, but I prefer to always run Righteous Protector unless I absolutely positively must be able to Divine Shield AoE Taunt. Now that Divine Shield AoE Taunt is really good on some of the giant dangerous trash pulls in raids, like if you were to pull all of the trash in front of Kel'Thuzad, having Final Stand there is pretty nice. And then you swap back to Righteous Protector for the Kel'Thuzad fight. The Prot Pallies rotation, despite how much damage it's capable of doing, is really pretty easy. You should use your cooldowns as much as possible unless you're holding them for a specific reason like an ad spawn or an extra damage phase. The only thing that really changes in AoE is that Avenger Shield jumps up in value ahead of Judgment. Otherwise, everything stays the same between AoE and single target. You always want to be standing in Consecration at all times when you're tanking. Now that isn't always possible, sometimes you have to move, but you get a lot of damage reduction passively just by standing in Consecration, especially considering you stack Mastery. So if you do have to move out of it because of a mechanic, you want to either move back in or recast it as soon as you've stopped moving. Maintaining Shield of the Righteous as much as you possibly can is really the key to staying tanky as a Paladin. Between that and managing your Word of Glory healing, I guess. Shield of the Righteous also does a good amount of damage, so you do want to be casting it fairly often. Really, you should never ever let it fall off at any point. if you do find that Shield of the Righteous is falling off, that probably means you're either doing something wrong with your holy power generation, like you're not using Judgment and Avenger Shield and Hammer of Wrath and Hammer of the Righteous and so on. You're not using those enough, or you are using Word of Glory to heal way too often. It's not the end of the world to spend holy power on Word of Glory. Now, obviously, you want to use all the free Word of Glory casts that you can. I mean, they're free. You should use them. It is annoying that they cost a GCD, but that's just the way it is. But as long as you're not letting Shield of the Righteous fall off, you're probably not using Word of Glory too much. If you find that you are letting Shield of the Righteous fall off and you're still using all of your holy power generators regularly, you're keeping them on cooldown, that means you're definitely using too many Word of Glories. In general, I feel like if you are spamming Word of Glory, you probably are making a mistake somewhere else, like letting Shield of the Righteous fall off. The one kind of causes the other. Or maybe you're letting something that should be interrupted free cast on you, or you're not using defensive cooldowns when you really need to. Now let's go over defensive cooldowns, and they're all very strong, but also pretty simple. Ardent Defender is your first line of defense as cooldowns go. It gives you a small amount of damage reduction, but also a cheat death effect while it's active. I always default to Ardent Defender when I start to feel a little more pressure than I think I can handle. Guardian of Ancient Kings is the big shield wall for Prot Pallies. It's good, and the cooldown reduction you get from Righteous Protector makes it available a lot more often than just every 5 minutes. Blessing of Sacrifice is a really powerful external defensive cooldown you can use on your party or raid members to help keep them alive during dangerous parts of a fight. Divine Shield and Blessing of Protection are both pretty useful for clearing non-dispellable debuffs or for immuning dangerous boss hits. Now, realistically, I could probably make like a full hour-long video just going through all the different mechanics in the game that maybe somebody smarter than me at Prot Pallies could make an hour-long video about all the mechanics that you can Divine Shield and Blessing of Protection to either immune them or mitigate them in different ways. But pretty much the way it works out is, if you hit Divine Shield once the boss has started casting a dangerous spell at you, for the most part, it will usually just hit on you and do nothing. There are a lot of abilities that will break through immunity, and there are other bosses where you need to know, who it will and not work on, because you don't want to Divine Shield and then have the boss go, okay, I'll swap targets mid-cast and blast the raid. But you can Divine Shield and taunt at the same time to force a boss to keep attacking you for the next 3 seconds of the taunt, even while Divine Shield is up. That's a pretty classic Paladin move. Something that's very important for every Prot Pallies to have is a Cancel Aura macro, which would read like this, /Cancel Aura Divine Shield, /Cancel Aura Blessing of Protection. I'll also throw that up on the screen just so you can read the way it would be written. 2 separate lines, those 2 auras that you want to be /Cancel Aura-ing. This is great for clearing debuffs such as bleeds. There aren't really that many bleeds in Season 4 Mythic Plus, but there are a few. There's one in Grimreal Depot that is insanely dangerous, and being able to very quickly take that off, it's on the ramp up after the first boss. Being able to clear that on a Pally and then immediately take that Divine Shield or Blessing of Protection off before enemies can turn and auto-attack your party to death is very important. And it just gives Pally a humongous advantage compared to I recently take that on like a monk and a bear druid, and going up to like 10 or 20 stacks or whatever on the debuff from the guys there was insanely dangerous. And on a Pally, you could get to like 10 stacks and then just pop it off. Easy. Totally free. It's an important macro and deserves a keybind. Just be sure not to hit it on accident if you do need to immune a mechanic and you're pressing Divine Shield or Blessing of Protection to immune that mechanic. Don't then immediately hit the Cancel Aura and clear it off. You also probably should not include these lines in your Blessing of Protection and Divine Shield macros or ability casts themselves. You want this to be a separate keybind so that you're not accidentally clearing when you need those to be up. So something I've been talking about on every tank guide is how to pull, and I think Paladin's pulling methodology is fairly straightforward, but I still want to do it justice. In general, if you have all your cooldowns available, you can basically just hit wings, throw an Avenger shield while you're moving into melee range with a pack, and then Divine Toll the pack once you're close to them. As soon as you hit Divine Toll, you're going to want to start slamming Shield of the Righteous to burn through all of the holy power as you generate it, because it will generate up to 5, and since your cap of holy power is 5, you can prevent overcapping if you're slamming that Shield of the Righteous immediately, but if you're not, you'll probably overcap and waste resources. I'll even cut in a couple of clips of me doing that right here. Check it out. Be ready to slam Shield of the Righteous as you're hitting Divine Toll. That's probably my biggest tip on Divine Toll. Anyways, once you've done that, no one's ever going to pull threat on you in AoE. But you would want to just continue rotation as normal, so Hammer of Wrath, get Consecration up, use Judgment, Avenger Shield when it's up, and so on. Now let's assume you're doing a pull without cooldowns available, so no wings to start, and let's even say no Divine Toll as well. Because if you had Divine Toll, you'd pretty much just treat it the same as you did, except no wings, and threat would probably be pretty easy. In this case, I would want to wait until Avenger Shield is up to pull. If I have really impatient DPS in the group, you can just open without Avenger Shield. Holding threat is usually pretty easy if you have Avenger Shield, but even if you don't have cooldowns, but let's say that you don't. If not, my goal would be to try and generate holy power and get Consecration down and cast Shield of the Righteous as quickly as I can. So Judgment on the way into melee range, Consecration, couple of Hammers of Justice, Judgment, whatever it's called, Shield of the Righteous, just to try and get that AoE threat out as quickly and as much as I possibly can in the moments while I'm waiting for Avenger Shield to come back up. You can taunt any stragglers and hit them with Judgment or Hammer of Justice, I suppose. Just do what you can to lock down threat and not let anybody tackle your teammates. Once Avenger Shield comes back up, you'll be able to lock down threat and you should be good. Ideally, you'll always just have Divine Toll up for the start of every AoE pull, and if you are nearing the end of a pull and you only have 1 or 2 mobs left, you should just hold it until the start of the next one, assuming it's going to be a multi-target pull. But that's not always super realistic. Sometimes you've used it and it's still 20 seconds to the start of the next pull. You're not just going to stand there looking at 5 dudes while you wait for Divine Toll to come back up. So you want to be ready to compensate for it if it's not available. The basic stat priority for Protection Paladin heavily favors Mastery. Mastery is the most important stat. Because of Holy Shield and the 4-piece bonus, you want as much as you can possibly get. It's defensively very strong, and because that block chance directly contributes to damage output, it's a great offensive stat as well. Haste and Versatility are both very good and very consistent. They're great too. Haste tends to feel a little better thanks to shortening your global cooldowns, but Versatility is also a really strong, safe stat as well. You can't go wrong with more of either of them. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are tier set bonuses, sockets, and item level, then Mastery, and then the rest of your stats don't matter nearly as much. Now, as far as the Season 4 Mythic Plus affix goes, I think taking Haste is the right call the majority of the time. Mastery is a better stat, but because the seasonal affix gives you flat mastery, it's actually subject to diminishing returns. Haste and Versatility, on the other hand, give you percentage increases which scale multiplicatively, and that means they give you way more stat budget. The reason you shouldn't just take Versatility is that it only grants 1% versatility per stack, whereas Haste grants 2%. This makes Haste the highest return from the Season 4 mechanic by a really big margin. And now let's talk enchants. Celestial Guidance is the most popular weapon enchant for Prot Pallies right now. It's competitive with Lightless Force and AoE, but Lightless Force is, I think, a little bit of sim bait. For one, it creates physical beams that interact in the world, and because those go cleaving around and mobs can move, it can potentially miss a lot of the targets that you're actually AoEing, which means that it won't perform as well in practical applications as it will in sims. Sinful Revelation is a good single target damage option, but unlike Celestial Guidance, it doesn't provide any sort of defensive value that you're going to be able to get out of, the stat budget that's offered by Celestial Guidance. Ultimately, I think Celestial Guidance is just the best choice for all purposes, pretty much always worth running all the time. I recommend 30 stats to chest and leech to cloak. You do a lot of damage and a lot of healing, so I think the value that you get out of leech is better than you could get out of the defensive value of avoidance or the utility of speed. And finally, strength to gloves and, hearth cooldown to bracers. That's it. Now before we finish up, let's go over some of the gear that's going to be available in Season 4 that's a little bit special, and talk about how to spend your dinars. Dinars are a currency you acquire by killing bosses in the Fated Raids, and you use them to purchase items from 3 vendors standing beside the Great Vault. They sell you up to 3 items in total, then they disappear. They sell weapons and trinkets from the 3 raids, and that is it. So basically you want to buy the best weapon and trinkets you can, and the best shield as well, and, then say goodbye. The items you buy are 278 and 285 item level, which is normal for Fated raids, but with another currency you acquire by killing heroic or mythic raid bosses, you can upgrade them to heroic or mythic item levels. So let's run through the important pieces of gear you want to pick up from this system, and I'm going to emphasize the top 4 pieces I think you're going to want, because maybe you're already good on at least one of those slots. That would be nice. First and foremost, it's Old Warrior's Soul from Soulbinds. This is the best trinket in the game for strength tanks. It grants almost twice as much haste as any other trinket once it's fully stacked up. It takes 100 seconds to stack to full, and it lasts for 15 seconds once you're out of combat. So you can use it in Mythic Plus, but you will need to chain pull. That's okay, that's pretty much how you treat most Mythic Plus normally anyways. This is an absolutely terrific trinket, one of my favorites, of the whole expansion, really of all time, and you basically never replace it until Dragonflight. It's just a big ol' haste thing. Great. Next is Devastated World Shard, the best weapon in the game for Protection Paladins. Alright, moving on. Ruined Crest of Lordaeron is the best shield in the game for Protection Paladins. Okay, moving on again. In 4th place, it's arguably the strongest item, Shard of Anhilda's Aegis. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis is the best defensive trinket in the game. It drops from the 9 in Sanctum of Domination, so it's fairly easy to just kill that boss and hopefully get one. The 9 is one of the easier bosses in the expansion, so that's probably the one hang-up I would have with actually buying this trinket outright for coins. It's just not that bad to go loot one. The drop chance isn't great, and it was better for me than any of the other items I've mentioned thus far in my experience, but still, this is a really strong defensive bonus. If you spent coins on it, you definitely shouldn't feel bad about that. It reduces a flat amount of damage from all hits and all dot effects while it's active, and that calculation is done after all damage reduction effects are calculated. So, armor, versatility, passive damage reduction auras, block, all of that comes into play, and then a flat amount is shaved off afterwards. That makes it fantastic. It's basically like a Divine Shield without losing threat for the 8 seconds at the top, and it's only on a 90-second cooldown. How neat is that? I'm surprised it never got nerfed, but here we are. If you still have leftover dinar after you've picked up all the stuff that's ahead of this on the list, I do think there are a couple of other decent trinket options available. The first Sigil, Reactive Defense Matrix, and Elegy of the Eternals. The first Sigil is just an enormous unused stat budget trinket that synergizes really nicely with Vinthir's on-pull burst damage combo. There's not really a lot more to say about it, it's just a very simple trinket that you can use to add an absolutely hilarious amount of damage to your opener. Reactive Defense Matrix is a really good combination of shielding and damage output, and it performs really well while tanking when you have really high uptime. So bosses like Sludgefist and Rygalon are good options for this trinket. Mythic Plus is obviously a place where it will perform really well. The only downside to running this on a Paladin is that, unlike other tanks, Paladin gets insane damage output scaling out of all of its stats because it has so many different cooldowns that it can layer together. So running a trinket that just offers strength and then direct damage and shielding instead of a stat budget is a little undesirable on a Pally. Still good, but not quite as good for Pally as it is for other tanks. Elegy of the Eternals gives a moderate chunk of mastery, which is really rare among trinkets available to tanks. It only gives you 121 mastery at 278 item level, which isn't that great. It also grants 10% of that, so 12 to your party members. It's a good trinket, probably the weakest of this whole collection though, but it's still great for all-around value, and it doesn't require you to be tanking all the time to maximize its value like Reactive Defense Matrix does. Finally, Weave of Warped Fates is a decent normal cheat death trinket. It doesn't really do anything except prevent your death, and the 8-minute cooldown is pretty long, but it is an option if you really feel like you need more defensive value that's passive. I don't think it's worth buying personally. In general, I think cheat death is usually a bit of a overvalued defensive layer. It can be very useful for preventing raid wiping deaths when damage is high and unpredictable, so I like cheat death effects for progression rating, but generally speaking, I think of them as passive defensive cooldowns on whatever their cooldown is. This one is 8 minutes, which is very long. That's way worse to me than Shard of Anhilda's Aegis, which is a 90-second defensive cooldown and actually does a lot of damage reduction while it's up instead of just preventing basically one big hit. In particular, Paladin has a lot less value out of a cheat death trinket thanks to having Ardent Defender, which is basically an active cheat death defensive cooldown that has pretty high uptime. Still, this is not a bad option some of the time. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis and Old Warrior Soul is the standard defensive trinket setup that I would run in like high level fortified Mythic Plus and on difficult raid bosses. If I wanted to do enormous damage in raids, I would probably swap the Shard of Anhilda's Aegis out for the first Sigil. If I wanted to maximize my damage in Mythic Plus, I probably would swap the Shard out either for a first Sigil if I was wanting to take down some tyrannical bosses, or maybe for a reactive defense matrix if I just sort of wanted a steady stream of more damage and shielding. I have a heroic item level 1 on my Monk, and while Monk isn't exactly comparable to the Paladin in damage output value, I think I was getting about 6 or 7% of my total DPS in Mythic Plus just out of that trinket, which is pretty good. Alright, now let's finish up by covering trinkets and important gear drops from dungeons in Season 4 Mythic Plus. Codex of the First Technique, the stamina trinket from Tazavesh, was nerfed fairly late into Season 3. It's a passive proc that grants 10% damage reflection. That sounds really nice, but it applies after all other damage reduction effects, including damage absorbs, so the shield from casting Avenger Shield if you're a spec into First Avenger, or from Word of Glory if you're using the Shielding Words conduit, actually means that this trinket is very bad for Paladin. Paladin gets a ton of offensive and defensive budget from strength as well, and this thing comes with stamina, so again, not actually very good for Pally. You have tons of damage reduction effects in the form of big armor pool, good passive defensive aura, a lot of versatility, block, absorbs from various different effects. So it's very possible for Codex of the First Technique to trigger its proc, First Technique, and then maybe not reflect any damage at all or very little. I've seen some, in the case of Warrior, which is even worse than it is for Pally, I've seen some Rygalon pulls where it was reflecting like dozens of damage per tick and like literally 100 DPS over the course of a whole Rygalon fight, worse than just running like a strength trinket and with an on use and never using the on use. So, that's pretty much where this is for Pally as well. Not actually a good trinket. Very popular among Blood DKs because their kit works a little different, and really it's only useful at the absolute highest level, but I think a lot of people have thought it was good, and I can admit that I was guilty of this for a little while. Thought it was good because it was good for some very specific specs and just sort of generally applied it to everybody, and it turns out, no, it's actually very bad. Solia's Secret Technique from Tazavesh Gambit is a good mastery trinket option. Now, in order to get mastery, it requires somebody else in your party to be running mastery as their number one secondary stat, which is actually not that common. So it might be a haste or versatility or crit trinket instead, and that makes me not like it as much as Old Warrior's Soul or Elegy of the Eternals. And it's tuned to basically give you the same amount of stat budget as Elegy anyways, so I really don't love this trinket, but it is a stat trinket that you can get from Mythic Plus, so that's not bad. Ticking Sack of Terror is another useful trinket from Tazavesh. In general, I would say it's not terrific, but it does have mastery, so it's definitely not terrible. It's a decent direct damage proc trinket with mastery on it, the end. Mechagon gear is mostly pretty simple. I would say the main pieces of valuable gear are the rings. Ideally, you want to get a logic loop of recursion and an overclocking bit band. They both have haste, and when combined, they give you a big fat haste proc. That's pretty good. The other notable pieces of gear from Mechagon are Fusion Hacker, which is a weapon with no stats but a pretty good damage over time proc, and Salvage Mecha Cycle Shielding, which is a mastery shield with a defensive proc and about half the normal secondary stats. Fusion Hacker is very good. Salvaged Mecha Cycle Shielding was very bad, but it got buffed and now it's okay. There's also Remote Guidance Device, which is a pretty basic damage trinket. You press the button, it does some single target damage and some AoE damage. That's it. Karazhan doesn't have a huge amount of gear either. The Choker of Barbed Rains from Atumen can provide a decent damage proc, but the stats are just okay. Eye of Command is a pretty simple trinket. It grants a lot of crits, so it's really just for DPS, but it's okay for DPS. Most of the gear in Karazhan is just okay. There's not really that much that's too crazy and worth talking about. The Ring of Collapsing Futures is good. It adds a free damage on use effect. It's great, at least until you can put together a Mechagon ring set. Similarly, the Seal of the Darkshire Nobles gives you, a little bit of extra damage reduction at the start of pulls, which is nice. It's not bad. And, versatility and mastery, that's okay too. And finally, let me just cover the drops from the 2 Warlords of Draenor dungeons, Iron Docks and Grimrail Depot. The Scepter of Brutality from Grimrail Depot is a haste mastery weapon, which is perfectly itemized. It's a pretty solid weapon option. The Enforcer's Stun Grenade is a trinket from Iron Docks. It's an on-use stat trinket. It gives you passive versatility with on-use versatility. I thought this was a very interesting trinket coming into the patch. I really wanted it to be good. I thought it might be good for tanks. It's not. It's very under budget for its item level, and it's terrible. And that's it on trinkets and important Season 4 gear. If I didn't include a piece of gear here, that's probably because it's not very good. It can still work while you try to get your hands on some of the items that are on this list, but it's not a permanent solution. As we approach the end of Shadowlands, Protection Paladin is still super strong and super fun. Prot Pallies were amazing through Season 2 and Sanctum of Domination, and although they struggled a bit early on in Sepulchre, they were still good in Mythic Plus Season 3, and they performed far better in Raid once Sepulchre started to receive some nerfs. Prot Pallies just got a nice little buff in Season 4, and I definitely think they seem like they're on the right track to really shine here as we reach the end of the expansion. Well, I think that covers it. If you have any questions about Protection Paladin and Shadowlands Season 4, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands and Dragonflight content, and thanks for watching. Bye!